Dave is one of the bravest, strongest characters I have ever met. He is a man of few words, so it falls to me to tell his remarkable story. Let me tell you from the outset, I understand if you find it hard to believe, but I swear on my grandmother's grave, though she isn't dead yet, that it's true. I've pieced together this story from interviews with his wife, friends, and other townsfolk. I'm John, a reporter with the Melbourne Times. You might have noticed I didn't list Dave himself as a source. That's because I only got him to speak to me once, and all he said was, "My dad once told me, don't have anything to do, do nothing, don't have anything to say nothing." That's all I got from him. With the material I've gathered, which is bizarre enough on its own, I've decided to write a book. It will explore both small-town dynamics and the actions of a remarkable man, an average intelligence man who, faced with choices that the modern court system might offer, chose to fight for fairness in his own way. I should point out that this is my interpretation since Dave doesn't talk much. My main source was his wife, who was quite open, mainly due to my promise of a couple of grand she needed to help with her legal bills. Let me set the scene. At the beginning of this story, Dave and his wife lived in a small isolated city of about 25,000 people with their 3 children, Sarah, 15, Mike, 14, and Pete, 12. Dave is a mechanic, while his wife works for the town's biggest car dealership, owned by an old-fashioned bully who is also the leading contender to replace the retiring mayor next year. The town's long-serving mayor is set to retire and Armand is the top candidate because all the other candidates withdrew, citing personal reasons. The town's newspaper until very recently showed no interest in Dave and his wife's story. The owner of the paper drives a car with a certain dealership sticker on the back window. I work for a major newspaper based in the state capital. Having been bullied at school, even if this wasn't a great story, I would have tried to get involved in Dave's fight against Goliath. Now, onto the story. As she lay on the bed, she buried her face in the pillow, trying to muffle her reactions as Donnie, who was above her, finished. She was grateful for the pillow as it saved her from having to fake her expressions. The weight of Donnie on her felt oppressive, and she struggled to breathe beneath him. She reflected on how things had changed since the beginning of their relationship. Initially, the newness and excitement had brought genuine pleasure. Now, the familiarity and lack of romance left her feeling unfulfilled. Donnie was an adequate lover, but the hurried encounters in a motel room didn't provide the satisfaction she had hoped for. When she started the affair 7 months ago, she imagined Donnie's prowess would be impressive, but in reality, it was quite similar in size to her husband Dave's. The novelty wore off quickly, and without the romantic build-up she craved, the encounters felt mechanical. She was determined to stay with Donnie, hoping for the romantic dinners and intimate moments she desired. Although she didn't love Donnie, she convinced herself that she would come to love him in time. 3 things troubled her plans: her own guilt, her strict Christian parents' disapproval, and Donnie's refusal to divorce his wife until he was elected mayor. This meant she had to settle for occasional quick liaisons rather than the romantic nights she yearned for. As her passion waned, her guilt intensified. Donnie rolled off her and began getting dressed. As usual, she would take a shower and leave at least an hour after him, ensuring they wouldn't be seen leaving or arriving back at work together. Donnie finished dressing and kissed her goodbye before opening the door. She reminded him to check outside to make sure there was no one they knew around. Donnie opened the curtains and glanced out, but then quickly drew back, letting the curtain fall. "Hey, Annie, there's a guy sitting on the hood of your car." He saw me open the curtain and looked right at me. She jumped out of bed and peered through the curtain. "That's Dave, your husband. How did he find out I was here?" "I'm not ready for that conversation yet. This could ruin everything." Donnie dismissed her concern with a laugh. "In this town, I don't think so. They're too smart to publish anything negative about me. They know I'll be in charge for the next 10 years, or I might even run for state politics. Don't worry about the town's reaction. This could be good. You always say we don't get enough time together. Now that he knows, things might change." She was still worried. "What's he going to do about it? I mean, look at him. He's half a foot shorter than me and about half my weight. He could tell your wife." "You're right. I don't want him tipping her off before we're ready. I'll go talk to him." Donnie bent down to kiss her again and then marched out of the door. She cracked the curtains slightly to watch. She saw her husband sitting in the car, and as their eyes met through the curtain, she felt guilt gnawing at her. She waited a few minutes, then heard Donnie's raised voice. She peered out again and saw Donnie leaning over Dave, who was still sitting in the car. Their eyes met again through the curtain, and she fled to the bathroom, showering until the water ran cold, trying to wash away her guilt. After she dressed, she braced herself to look out the window again when Donnie called. "How quickly did your husband leave after I had words with him?" "I don't know. I haven't looked since you left." "Well, he's still there," she reported when she checked again. Donnie was puzzled. "My usual tactics work." "What did you say to him?" "I just told him the facts of life and pointed out the health hazards of standing in our way and the futility of trying to stop us." "Don't worry, Annie. It'll be dark in an hour. Stay where you are and I'll send a couple of my associates to talk to him." True to his word, an hour later there was a heavy knock on her door. She opened it to find Frank and Rick, two of Donnie's employees, holding Dave between them. They were so large that Dave's feet barely touched the ground. She let them in and Dave, with a neutral expression, stared at her. She quickly averted her eyes and tried to leave, but she heard a sickening thud and a rush of breath. Reflexively she looked back and saw Rick holding Dave while Frank had his fist poised. As Dave stood up and looked her straight in the eye, she felt sick and fled. She picked up some takeout for her family and faced questions from her children about their dad's absence and unreturned phone calls. She slept poorly, and when she left for work the next day, there was still no sign of her husband. Donnie wasn't in either, and she couldn't bring herself to talk to Frank or Rick. Returning home late, she found the house empty. She called Sarah and Mike, but both phones went to voicemail. Worried, she waited until after dinner when she heard a car in the driveway. Looking out, she saw her kids getting out of her parents' car with both her mom and dad. They entered the house and her mother began the conversation. "Annie, why didn't you tell us Dave was in the hospital?" I didn't know," and stammered. Silence fell over the room and everyone stared at her. Her father broke the silence. "Maybe you didn't know, but the fact that you're not rushing over there or even curious about why he's there tells me it's no surprise to you." Faced with this logic and the accusing stares and slumped into a chair, unable to meet their eyes. She might as well have screamed her guilt. After a minute, she fled to her room. She heard her parents preparing dinner for the children, and her mother trying to coax her out. Eventually, when everything was quiet downstairs, she ventured out. The hum of her children's conversation abruptly stopped when she entered the room. "Have you all eaten dinner?" she asked. Her children stared at her silently. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "Mom, you know how Daddy got hurt, don't you?" "I had no idea he was in the hospital," and replied, her voice trembling. Silence settled over the room as everyone, except perhaps little Pete, understood that the lack of a denial was as good as an admission. Pete sobbed and hurried over to wrap his arms around Anne. "What's wrong, sweetie?" "It hurts me to see Daddy hurt so much," Pete said, describing Dave's injuries: broken ribs, a broken nose and 2 black eyes. And recoiled in horror at the realization of what she had not prevented. Mike broke the ensuing silence. "Why did you hurt Daddy, Mom? What did he do to you?" Anne's response was instinctive. "He didn't do anything to me." Slowly, she realized her failure to deny involvement in Dave's suffering. In her mind, she blamed herself. She sent the children to bed and drank heavily, seeking to escape the guilt. The next day at work, Donnie avoided discussing Dave, but suggested they talk about it at their usual motel. Frustrated and agreed. When she arrived, Donnie attempted to be intimate, but she snapped at him, which made him stop. He shrugged when she asked about his instructions to his associates. Donnie showed no interest or empathy regarding Dave's injuries and then stoned out. She arrived back at the office just before Donnie, and the tension between them was palpable. That night, she wasn't overly concerned when her children returned home late. Her parents dropped them off, and as soon as dinner began cooking, they left without a word. The children answered her questions with monosyllabic responses, and conversation ceased when she entered the room. The next day, things remained tense at work, and her empty home was uncomfortable. That night, she sat at the kitchen table, trying to figure out how to mend her relationship with her children. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she barely noticed when her children returned and prepared a meal around her. She only realized when Sarah placed a plate in front of her, and ate alone in the kitchen while the children ate in front of the TV, unable to handle their accusing stares. She dreaded what Dave might be telling them. After another cold day at work, she returned to find a bustling house. Her mother greeted her at the door. "Are you going to feed your children today?" "Of course, my mother," Anne replied. Her mother interrupted, then left, and saw Pete carrying a plate of cheese and biscuits upstairs. No food upstairs, she called after him, realizing that Dave was home. She busied herself making dinner, glancing occasionally at the stairs, which seemed like a psychological barrier. One or two of the children were upstairs at any given time. Sarah took Dave's food up while they sat at the dining table. Pete innocently asked, "If Daddy didn't do anything to you, why did you hurt him? Why won't you talk to him?" And had no answer as Sarah began explaining guilt to Pete and fled, leaving a half-eaten dinner and walking for several hours. When she returned, the children were in bed, needing things from the master bedroom and bathroom. She crept upstairs and peeked into the open door. Seeing Dave asleep on his side facing the doorway, with his swollen face and the white stripes on his nose, struck her deeply. His ragged breathing added to her anguish. She quietly gathered her necessities and placed them in the spare room across the hall. Returning to the master bedroom, she intended to whisper an apology, but upon seeing Dave's open eyes staring at her, she fled again. That night she struggled to sleep, feeling Dave's gaze through the walls. When her relationship with Donnie first became serious, she anticipated conflict with Dave. What she had imagined as an academic exercise now felt painfully real. She pressured Donnie the next morning to expedite his plans to divorce his wife, but he insisted there would be no divorce or acknowledgement of the affair until after the election. If she wanted to divorce her husband now, it was up to her. He would assist with time off and money, but left the rest to her. This realization led her to suspect she might be nothing more than a fling for Donnie. Though uncertain, the urgency of her situation forced her to continue on her chosen path, and took time off to consult a lawyer and arrange to have Dave served as soon as the papers were ready. She left the divorce proceedings in the lawyer's hands, seeking a fair settlement, primary custody of the children, reasonable visitation rights for Dave, child support and alimony. She also wanted residency of the house until she was ready to move out, which should be just after the election next year. The next part of the story won't make sense unless you know the layout of the dealership that Donnie owns and works at. At the front of the building is a huge showroom. Along the back wall are 4 glass-walled offices with solid walls between them. On the far right is Donnie's office, then Anne's, followed by the offices of the admin manager and the service manager. As the offices are long and thin, there is only one place to put a desk at the opposite end from the door, against the end wall. Because Donnie's and Anne's doors are at opposite ends of their offices, their desks are effectively adjacent, separated only by a solid wall. The service center is around the back. Anne was busy tapping away at her keyboard and didn't see Dave walk into the dealership. He walked straight up to the reception desk, leaned on it and stared into Anne's office. One of the receptionists recognized him. He had coached her softball team in high school. She knew he was Anne's husband, although he had never been there before. She tried to engage him in conversation, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed on the offices. The receptionist couldn't tell if Dave was targeting Anne or Donnie. While she continued to talk, the other receptionist went to Anne's office and told her Dave was there, and from her vantage point, saw where Dave's eyes were fixed. They were locked on hers, even from a distance. Quickly she broke eye contact but still felt his gaze on her. Without looking directly, she reached for the Venetian blind control and adjusted it so he couldn't see her. A minute later, she peed through a small gap between the blinds. The two receptionists were whispering to each other, and Dave's neutral expression was still visible through the blinds, despite his bruises and bandages, and picked up the phone and called Donnie, asking him to check his window. Donnie answered, "What's he doing here?" She replied, "I don't know, but get rid of him." Donnie hung up the phone and strode out to the reception desk. "Mr. Brown, this is a private business. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Dave did not respond and continued staring at Anne's window. Donnie, growing impatient, warned, "Don't make me call the police." Without looking away from the window, Dave handed his phone to Donnie. In a hushed tone meant only for Dave, Donnie said, "So I messed around with your wife." Get over it. Unfortunately, Donnie didn't realize how clearly his words were heard by both receptionists, and peeking through the Venetian blinds again, saw their heads turn towards her. A few minutes later and heard a commotion at the reception. She looked out and saw Frank and Rick carrying Dave towards the outer doors. Dave, traveling backwards, kept his eyes on and until he was out of sight, and thought to herself that he deserved it, but then remembered that all her interactions with Dave had been internal dialogues until he had caught her with Donnie. He hadn't known their marriage was in trouble. She felt a pang of empathy and rushed to her door, and saw Donnie with a sadistic grin and pleaded, "No, Donnie, not again. Let me handle it." Donnie gestured for and to return to her office. She opened the blinds again, fuming. Donnie cancelled his afternoon appointments and stayed in his office while employees constantly visited the reception area. At 1 p.m., 2 police officers arrived and spoke to the receptionists. Donnie must have seen them and invited them to his office. The blinds were closed and the officers left 15 minutes later. Anne, dreading going home, asked if she could move into the company-rented motel unit, the same one she and Donnie had used. She snuck home, packed a suitcase and texted Dave and Sarah to say she wouldn't be home that night. Donnie helped her unpack at the unit, and in her desperation for distraction, she allowed him to be intimate with her. At 6:30 p.m. her mother called before answering and thought it typical of Dave to use her family against her. Her mother asked where she was and why she wasn't home and replied, "I'm not coming home tonight. Dave can look after the kids." Her mother responded, "Dave is in the hospital again. He'll be there for at least a week this time." And hurried, "I'll be home as soon as I can." As she hung up, she asked Donnie, "What did you do to him this time? The stubborn prick has to learn that he can't mess with me." And quickly dressed and sprinted home, picking up takeout along the way. When she threw open her front door, she saw all 3 children sobbing in the lounge, comforted by her parents. Her mother intercepted her and led her into the kitchen. "What on earth is going on? You abandon our children while your husband is in the ICU, and you come home with takeout for their main meal of the day? What is happening?" Her mother's nostrils flared. "It's none of your business, Mother. Dave and I are just going through a rough patch, that's all," and replied. The 2 women stare each other down for half a minute before her mother broke the silence. "I noticed you showed no surprise when you found out your husband is in the hospital. That tells me what the children say is true. You did have something to do with Dave ending up in the ICU." "No, Mom, I had no idea Dave was in the hospital again," and said. Silence settled over them again, only to be broken by Anne's mother. "Well, aren't you curious about what your boyfriend did to your husband this time?" "What boyfriend?" Anne asked, but her silence and the way she looked at the floor gave her away. Her mother continued, "You reek of someone else. This time the doctors are fairly certain he has a fractured cheekbone and possibly a fractured skull. They believe one of the ribs that was broken last time was pushed into his chest and punctured it. The ambulance driver told me they picked him up from an alley near your work. So tell me, and what did the poor guy do to deserve this treatment?" And couldn't answer and was too busy sobbing. Her mother sat in silence until and ran upstairs to her bedroom. She noticed blood on the sheets of the bed she hadn't slept in for 4 days and cried into her pillow. She lost track of time until there was a soft knock at the door. It was her mother. "I have to take Dad home," her mother said. "All this stress is causing his blood pressure problems to come back. He almost fainted when he stood up just now." "Okay, Mom. I'll see you out." By the time Anne got downstairs, her father was walking out the front door. He gave her a withering look but didn't say anything. As she said goodbye, the children slipped off to bed and sat trying to think of a way out of this mess. The only way she could see was forward. Breakfast the next day was silent. When Anne got to work and discovered Donnie would be gone for the day, she texted him, begging him to meet her at the motel that evening. She also texted her mother, asking her to meet the kids after school and look after their dinner. The reply was a simple yes, good idea. Donnie met her after work and reassured her that their plan was on track. The police couldn't connect either of them to Dave's 2 beatings and hadn't mentioned her husband's second assault. Although Donnie had arranged it, she could have stopped it by running after them as her husband was carried out. Instead, she allowed Donnie to be intimate with her until after 9 p.m. Then Anne showered and went home. It was almost 10 when she arrived. All three children were awake and looking at her expectantly. "Why aren't you guys in bed?" she asked. Her mother replied on their behalf. "I let them stay up until you got home. They're eager to know how their father is." "I don't know." And said. "Didn't you go see him tonight?" her mother asked. And remained silent. Her mother continued. "What did you do? Tell me you didn't get me to cover for you while you went to see your lover while Dave is in the hospital." "I never told you I was going to the hospital," and said. Her mother swung around, grabbed her coat and headed for the door. Over her shoulder she said, "You disgust me. I'm ashamed to call you my daughter. Don't ask me to look after your children again, unless it's so you can go to your husband and beg his forgiveness." And thought she was managing with the little sleep she was getting. She reflected that if she had abandoned her plans, it would have made everything pointless. Her mother's call the next day at work was not an apology. "How could you be so heartless?" her mother asked. "Your husband finally gets out of the ICU and what does he get? A visit from an ugly process server and divorce papers. Who are you and what have you done with my daughter?" In her pain, and had forgotten that her divorce process was on autopilot. The lawyer had followed her instructions and served Dave as soon as the papers were ready. As a reflex, I tried to resolve the immediate issue. "Mom, can you look after the kids tonight so I can go see Dave?" "No, I can't, Ann. Your father is in the same hospital as your husband. He had a heart attack today and they're going to put in stents tomorrow. Goodbye." Anne's mother hung up and rushed home early to be there when the children got off the school bus. When the bus arrived, she was met with the sight of her children and her parents. Calls to two of their phones went straight to voicemail. 2 hours later, she received a text instructing her to pick up the children at the hospital. They had walked there after school. On the way home, she scolded them for making her worry. They remained silent and stared out the car windows. It was around this time that I became aware of the tragic story of Dave and Donnie. I was sitting in my office, struggling to find my next story amid an unusually quiet news period, when my phone rang. It was Matt Nygrum, an old classmate from journalism school. Matt, who had always shunned larger organizations in favor of small-town issues, had been working in the regional center where the story was unfolding. The doctors and nurses at Dave's hospital were so appalled by Anne's behavior that they contacted Matt. Using his usual skill, Matt quickly uncovered the affair between Anne and Donnie, as well as the 2 beatings Dave had suffered. Although no one directly said it, the fact that Dave had been seen being carried out of the dealership by known associates of Donnie suggested a connection. Matt tried to speak with Dave, but Dave refused to talk. He contacted the police, only to find out there was no active investigation. Matt submitted his story to his editor, only to have it rejected and torn up. Disheartened, Matt resigned and sent the story to me. I offered him a position at my paper, and the following week I cleared my desk and left for an assignment in Hicksville. The next week was very uncomfortable for Anne. Her children treated her coldly, and her social life was hampered by her mother's unavailability to help with the kids. She picked them up from the hospital every night. Donnie was away on business during the day, and the only time she saw him was one night when he managed to sneak into her house after the children were in bed. That was the first time they spent the entire night together. On Friday, Anne received a call from the school requesting a semi-urgent meeting. During the meeting, she learned that they were very concerned about Sarah's rapid weight loss and couldn't believe it and hadn't noticed. They also expressed worries about Michael's sudden propensity for violence and little Pete being bullied because he was always crying. Overwhelmed, and decided to expedite the divorce and hoped it would resolve soon. Initially, Anne declined an invitation to go out with 4 of her girlfriends that Friday night. With Dave still in the hospital and Donnie unavailable, she tried unsuccessfully to get her children to open up. Frustrated, she left the children at home and went out with her friends. She left her whereabouts with Sarah in case of an emergency. About an hour into her evening, while fielding questions from her friends who had heard rumors about the violence inflicted on her husband, and spotted Dave sitting at an adjacent table. He had a black eye, a bandaged face, and was hunched over in pain. And panicked and turned back to her friends, trying to downplay the situation. Her friends saw her reaction and noticed Dave's condition. They could only wonder about the effort it took for him to make such a silent protest. One friend made an excuse to visit the bar, while the two who knew Dave best went over to speak with him. The rest of the group, puzzled, left and hesitated outside the bar, wondering if she should offer Dave a ride. Her conscience told her she should, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. She had told Donnie she loved him just 2 weeks ago to divert suspicion, and now it was clear that had been a lie. Feeling self-centered, she drove home to find her mother looking after the kids. They hadn't seen each other in a week, and then suddenly realized she had never inquired about her father's health. They both got the kids to bed, then turned to discuss her father. The topic shifted awkwardly when her mother brought up Dave, but she tried to steer the conversation elsewhere. Her mother was persistent, asking if Dave had done anything to warrant a divorce, and mentioned a couple of minor issues. Seeing her mother's skepticism, she explained that she had simply fallen out of love with her husband and in love with someone else. She found it easy to lie to her mother, not mentioning that she used Donnie's attention as a way to upgrade her situation. Her mother was blunt in her criticism of her decision to leave her marriage and children, and she sat through it uncomfortably. She denied any involvement in Dave's 2 incidents of violence. At the end of their conversation, she didn't inquire if her mother had discussed forgiveness with Dave. In her mind, her plan was still in place. She did ask if Dave was coming home that night, and was coldly informed that he was due to be released in 2 days. He had called earlier, asking where she was. Realizing Dave must have left the hospital to go to a bar, she did a lot of thinking over the next 2 days. She decided the decent thing to do was apologize to Dave for her infidelity, but also point out that his actions were the result of his own behavior. She would demand that he speak to the children and explain that she had nothing to do with his pain. She thought there was a reasonable chance he would agree, and a small chance he might beg her to stay. She was certain, though, that any aggression on his part would lead to threats of reducing his share of the marital assets. On the night of Dave's release, Donnie left work early and went to the unit. They both walked out of the room together just after 6 p.m., greeted by Dave, Sarah, Mike and Peter watching from across the parking lot. Donnie approached them and Dave said something inaudible, then positioned himself protectively in front of the children. Donnie looked at the 3 witnesses, turned away,